To start, I think it'd be great if you could provide us an overview of supply chain management. I know your focus is in wine, so maybe if you could explain to us what a supply chain would look like from taking a basket of grapes of a vineyard and bringing them to a grocery store and a bottle of wine.
Yes. So the way to think about supply chains is they're the series of steps that need to happen to get a product all the way from the start to the consumer. So if we think about a winery, they either need to have their own vineyard or they need to contract with another vineyard to get the wine grapes. They're also going to need to buy other supplies like bottles, corks, and packaging materials. And this step is called sourcing. The next step is production, and that's where the winery ferments the grapes, puts it in sort of storage tanks or barrels to mature, then ultimately bottles it. And from there, we go through the next step, which is distribution. And this step in the US is mandated because of all the controls around alcohol that were put in about 100 years ago. And so now the wine gets transported typically to a large warehouse. Then the final step the final step for business purposes is the retail stage. So that is where the wine then goes to either like a supermarket, like Costco or Total Wine, or to a place like a hotel or a bar where the wine is consumed on premise. And that is all those steps are necessary. And there are some exceptions to the flow in California. We can actually, as consumers, go to a winery and buy a wine from the tasting room direct or sign up for a wine club. And also in California, this is one of the few states where this is possible, some store like Trader Joe's can directly buy from a supplier. So wine is often cheaper in California than it is in other states because we've cut out that necessary tier.
Yeah, a word that came up when you were providing your overview was collaboration. My guess is that there's certain industries in which a firm that participates in the industry specializes in one stage from production to distribution. And then there's maybe other industries where, say you take a winery in Napa that does, picks the grapes, ferments the wine, and then distributes it in its own sort of like on-campus location, retail location.
Yeah.
Could you maybe speak to the role of collaboration and how the degree to which a firm collaborates with other firms varies across different industries?
We sometimes in supply chain, it's called how vertically integrated are you? So some wineries do own their own vineyards and even have tasting rooms and all that. But in general, that is somewhat of the exception. And for most of the U.S., there's something called the three-tier distribution system, where it's actually mandated that a producer has to be separate from a distributor and has to be a separate entity from the retailer. And there are some kind of silly situations where if we take, the fancy restaurant like the French Laundry up in Napa, and they want to serve a bottle of Opus One, which is also in Napa, that wine gets transported all the way to a distribution center like in Lodi, Pennsylvania, because it has to go through the three-tiered distribution system. So
interesting.
It was created, you might say, why would we do that? Why would we be inefficient? Mm-hmm. The three-tiered distribution system was essentially created at the repeal of Prohibition to slow the supply chain of alcohol. They thought that was a good thing.
Interesting. This brings up a concept that I didn't anticipate covering in our conversation, but I'd love to get your perspective on. in overregulation or maybe even the cutback of regulation. I would imagine, that's a great example of a regulation that impacts supply chains today, and it's kind of outdated, it seems. What role does great versus not so great regulation play in supply chain?
Well, it's always a balance. You want there to be a certain amount of regulation for example, we want to make sure that the wine doesn't have methanol in it, which there have been, I won't mention countries or anything like that, but there have been instances in the past where there have been additives and that have harmed people.
Yeah.
So you want regulation to protect people, but then at a certain point, if regulation can be stifling, and the wine industry has been trying to fight some of the rules, but the distributors are very interested in keeping that middle tier that regulated. And so the distributors will argue that, oh, no, we shouldn't allow some winery in Napa to do direct shipments to someone's home because a underage person might order wine. And realistically, how many 19-year-olds are going to buy a $40 bottle of Chardonnay? Yeah. But the reason that the distributors are fighting against this sort of allowance is they want to prevent stores from going directly to the wineries. And there is in Washington, the state of Washington, there is a winery that Chateau Saint Michel that is the largest domestic Riesling producer in the U.S. And Costco, which is headquartered in Washington, realistically, they felt that they should be able to go directly to Chateau Saint Michel and buy and not have to go through a distributor. And this was actually a case that was brought up and argued to the courts. And I believe that, alas, it was defeated. So the price that is paid is ultimately the consumer. So the consumer pays more for wine that has to go through the three-tier system.
Now, I know that your research takes a deep focus in wine specifically. I'd love if we could kind of just take a step back and learn a bit more about what interested you in wine, especially in researching wine and not just, I'm sure, enjoying it, outside of work. So.
Well, I do enjoy wine occasionally. I wanted to study a product that was relevant to the local economy, and that's wine. We are the largest winemaking state in the nation, producing more than 80% of American wine. And the U.S. itself is actually the fourth largest producer of wine in the world. And the wine industry employs over 1 million people nationwide. About half of those jobs are in California. The rest are supporting the other parts of the supply chain. And wine contributes, $170 billion to America's GDP. About half of that is in the state. And alcohol is a very highly taxed commodity. So wine actually contributes a fair amount to tax revenue. I think it's around $21 billion annually.
Now, I'd love to relate your supply chain expertise to events the audience at home experienced, in particular COVID-19. If you could provide us an overview with the role supply chains played during the pandemic and how they might have evolved since the pandemic, I think that'd be great for me and the audience watching at home.
Okay. A lot of people have been studying supply chain for a while, but a lot of people didn't really pay that much attention to it until the pandemic hit. And not only did they have empty shelves in the store when they ordered something on Amazon Prime, it did not take a day or two. It often took weeks. So companies paid a little bit more attention to it, but you didn't hear them talking about it quite as much. They had optimized their supply chains a little bit more for being as low cost as possible, at the expense of something that we call resiliency, being able to bounce back if there is a disruption. And so the pandemic was a huge disruption, and it wasn't just a short-term disruption. So that threw people for a loop. And so a lot of companies have started to rethink their supply chains, and there's been a lot of what we call nearshoring in the past few years. So relocating manufacturing from Asian countries and closer to us, often in Mexico and Canada. So nearshoring was really big in 2021 through 23, essentially just up to now.
And does nearshoring tend to coincide with an increase in resilience of a supply chain?
Yes, because now you don't have to wait a month for the product to arrive. And also another thing with you might not put all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. You might have a couple different suppliers that you work with. So if one of them is unable to, for whatever reason, meet your production needs, you might be able to increase your order with a different supplier.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned resiliency in your answer. I'm curious if you could describe to us what the core components of a resilient supply chain are. Does it tend to deal a lot with how well staffed a facility is, diversification in geographical locations of facilities, or perhaps relationships a firm might have with other distributors that allow them to have different channels of moving product from one point to another?
So there's a few components of resiliency. Part of it is being having your supply chain partners be near you, and having multiple supply chain partners. But to get back to something we touched on earlier, being a little bit more collaborative with them. So finding out, and this involves data, and little sort of side pitch here, data analytics is a very good thing to study as a student right now, because we are starting to see the need for more of this in our supply chain. So we can see in closer to real time if there are problems that are happening. It used to be in the old days that the company would just have a list of suppliers on a spreadsheet, and then they'd call them up when the order didn't arrive. So now we need to be a little bit more proactive. So if we know that there is a problem going on because the supplier lets us know, then we can react and be proactive as a company. And that benefits, that also speaks to longer term relationships. So maybe a supplier doesn't get our order this month, but if they treat us well and let us know, hey, there's a problem where you might need to look for other things, we'll come back to them later. So it's about fostering longer term trust and data sharing.
Now, moving forward, trade policy is, of course, a big topic in the news, especially given the focus of the Trump administration on tariffs. For all of us at home trying to make sense of how trade policy ends up affecting supply chain management, what can go right, what can go wrong? How should we think about the ways in which trade policy interfaces with supply chains?
Okay, well, today's supply chains are inherently global, and tariffs just wreak havoc on them. One of the ostensible goals of tariffs is to help American manufacturers, but American manufacturers often source products from overseas. So if let's just go back to wine, for example. If we think about wine corks, most of the wine corks in the world come from Portugal and Spain, just because cork trees grow there really well, and that's sort of traditionally where the industry for producing cork has been. So if there were to be a tariff on all EU products, which, who knows with this administration, then now an American winery has to pay for an additional price on those corks. And it's not like we can, in the US, all of a sudden just grow a bunch of cork trees overnight. So it creates problems there. And it's even more if we think about the automotive industry. I think Ford has been quoted on saying that tariffs are going to create higher costs and chaos because a product that is as complex as an automobile, if we go back to the suppliers, they often have like multiple tiers of supply. So if you think about a component in your car, like a stereo system, well, Ford didn't make that. That comes from someone else, and the stereo system producer bought electronics from someone else, and the electronics use metals from somewhere else. So there's often what we call 3 tiers of suppliers. So in the U.S., let's see. Remember how I talked about nearshoring, and I said we brought a lot of manufacturing back, and it's shared with Mexico and Canada. And Canada, for example, estimates that 70% of the products they export to the U.S. are not for end consumers like you or I. It's for something that goes into a manufactured good. So we really kind of co-produce things with these other countries. So if we put 25% tariff on, which, we might do that, right? It's not just that that's a one-time thing. You could actually, with a 3-tiered supply process and then the manufacturing process, something could hit tariffs 4 times. So essentially, a 25% tariff, if everything went from the U.S. to Canada, from the U.S. to Canada, and so on. Because of course, if we are going to put tariffs on at 25% on a nation, they're going to retaliate. That's just the way it goes. So then all of these 25% start multiplying onto each other, and so that's you can have prices of an end product more than double. So that's why it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear a bit more about the tier system you mentioned. What typically gets grouped into each respective tier?
So I can speak to mainly automotive and other vehicles.
So it does tend to change the model of the tiers.
Yeah, so they typically call it a 3-tier system where the first tier is the one closest to manufacturing, and those are those are component systems like the stereo system, the air conditioning system, all of that, and typically a car company buys that, but then those systems are composed of another set of components, and those are the tier 2, and then those components are typically from metals and other things, and those tend to be tier 1. So just in general, the more complex the product is, the more tiers there are. So that's why it's especially challenging for technical products. For something like avocados, where we get, I think, 70% of our avocados come from Mexico. Okay, yeah, we've put 25% tariff on it. It's a relatively simple product, but for I'm switching countries, but Mexico, if a pickup truck is produced in Mexico, they estimate that a lot of those components are coming from the U.S. So we're really kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with tariffs if we decide that we're going to do them on our two closest neighbors, because then in a way it's cheaper to source things from Asia, because those things for the most part are mostly made just in Asia, and they're only hitting the tariff cycle one time. And I don't think that anyone really thinks that it's a good idea to reverse the trend of nearshoring.
Yeah, and I heard you mention the term tariff cycle. Should the way the audience conceptualize that be, if you have a really complex product like an automobile, because there are so many parts that are being purchased under the subjection of a retaliatory tariff, that would be an example of a product that is going to incur multiple iterations of that tariff cycle. Whereas a product like avocados, it's relatively straightforward, it might only be affected by a tariff in one cycle.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So when the avocados are growing in Mexico, then they come over the border, get taxed 25%. There we go. But back to the pickup truck example, if we're doing a 25% tariff, it's effectively with over half of the parts coming from the U.S., we're essentially going to be hit with tariffs twice, because when the parts come in from the U.S. to Mexico, well, there'll be retaliatory tariffs, because no country is going to say, oh yeah, that's fine, we don't mind that you're putting a tariff on us. The tariffs always have retaliation. It's called a trade war, and it's known that nobody wins in a trade war. So that's something that goes on. Something also, aside from just the threat, aside from the actual cost, it's the threat of tariffs that are creating right now a lot of uncertainty in businesses, because they have to do long-term planning. And if we know that, there's going to be a 25% tariffs coming on, we might be able to stockpile a few things, as much as our cupboards can take, and as much as we can front load on our credit card, right? But that's really not how businesses work. That isn't effective for them. They don't want to forward buy a lot of inventory. So if they don't know, in a few months what is going, how much tariffs are going to be, and if this particular country is going to be having them, there is a lot of uncertainty. And there's been a measure, I'm not an economist, but I've heard this from economists, there's a measure of uncertainty right now that is the highest it's been since the pandemic. And what this does is businesses will delay capital investments, and they'll delay hiring as well. So tariffs end up sort of hampering our economy in the long term as well.